Chapter 21. The Boat Competition. Amy's slim arms were folded across her chest. "I can't believe you were caught stealing again," she said icily. "It was dumb." "I know," Damien shrugged. Amy looked at him skeptically. Their friendship had been slowly developing. Weeks ago, she had thought Damien only cared about surfing, but gradually as he worked on the road, she had come to see diligence, creativity, and a caring heart. However, Nancy had told Georgia, who had just told Amy, that the 3 Beach Boys had stolen from the store again. "I don't know if I can trust you," she protested. Turning away to go work on his boat, Damien mumbled, "You probably shouldn't." It wasn't quite the answer Amy was hoping for. She was looking for a reason to keep trusting, not to stop. Walking over, whistling a cheerful tune, Zahir said, "Ready to try out the boat?" Amy would have rather continued the discussion with Damien, but she saw her opportunity had vanished. Damien was running toward Franz. "Coming," she replied. As she helped Zahir take their boat to the water, Amy thought about Damien's response. She felt sorry for him. According to Georgia, Uncle Louis had made the Beach Boys dig enough supplies out of Mining Hill to do a fair trade for 10 pipe cleaners and 6 bananas. It didn't take them long to fulfill the consequence, but all the respect the Beach Boys had earned by working so well on the road had been eroded. Still, Amy wished she hadn't been so hard on Damien. "What are you thinking about?" Zahir asked her curiously. Coming back to reality, Amy shook her head. "Oh, nothing important." Smiling, Zahir said, "I asked you if you wanted to ride in the boat or not." "Oh, really? Is our boat ready for someone to ride in it?" Cocking his head to one side, Zahir looked at her curiously. "Well, yesterday we tried all those stones in it, and it didn't sink." "Sure then," Amy replied hesitantly. Still unable to swim, as were the majority of the tinies, she was afraid of the deep water. "If you're sure it's safe." Zahir slowly put his weight in the boat. For the last week, everyone had worked on their boats during school hours, and Zahir was confident theirs was now ready. It wobbled slightly from side to side, but it floated fine. "We have a great boat," he boasted. Looking at it with pride, Amy agreed. Corks, neatly tied together, formed the base. A thick layer of tinfoil wrapped around the base and up the sides. Molded red wax stripes decorated the sides and gave it all extra strength. Seeing that it was floating well, Amy mustered her courage to step in. The wobbles were a little unnerving at first, but once she was sitting, she realized the boat would hold them both well above the water level. Relaxing, she began to feel safe. Picking up one of the wooden boards, Zahir dipped it in the lake and pushed the boat along. Amy picked up the other stick and tried to do the same. Instantly, they began spinning in circles. "Hey, this is fun," Zahir laughed. "Maybe we should call it Spinner." For a few minutes, they were content to spin, but then Zahir decided there must be some way to go straight. As the other tinies finished up their boats, the new sailors tried to find out how to propel their craft forward. Finally, they discovered they needed to paddle on opposite sides. Once they had coordinated their efforts, they had a great time gliding around the lake. "Let's call it the Red Bird," Amy suggested, as the boat surged forward with their strokes. "It flies across the water." They made it all the way out to the floating surfboard that Damien had anchored far from shore that morning. It was a turnaround point for the race. There was only an hour left for everyone to try their boats before Uncle Louis planned to announce the winners. The competition needed to be over before lunch while the lake was still calm. Once the waves came in, it would be too dangerous. As Amy and Zahir paddled around the shoreline, they observed their competition. Rosa, Lily, Odin, and Ponzi were actually pulling their boat apart for the 3rd time. Odin was yelling at Ponzi, Rosa and Lily were crying, and once again Uncle Louis was trying to mediate the situation. There was no doubt that Georgia, Yu-Yan, Tina, and Vanitha had the most attractive boat. It was molded from tinfoil with very fancy loops and swirls. A big arched canopy on top had several colorful balloons stretched across it. While it was floating well and the balloons provided shade from the sun, the girls had still not discovered a way to avoid going in circles. As Amy and Zahir steered back to shore, Amy noticed the Beach Boys were bringing their invention down. She watched curiously. The last time they had tried to sail their boat, it had tipped over, throwing them into the water, which they all thought was hilarious. They must work at night, Amy said to Zahir. Their boat always looks different every morning. The Beach Boys' craft seemed to be made entirely from red wax on the outside and was very slim and sleek. Amy was curious about the strange apparatus that was attached to the back of the boat. The stolen pipe cleaners, which now legitimately belonged to them, rose out of the back of the boat and circled around. No one had been able to figure out what they were for, and no one had seen the boat float successfully. "Only a short time left, everyone," Uncle Louis announced loudly. "I'm going to count to 100. Then regardless of whether or not your boat is ready, I want to see you give it your best attempt." "It's a dumb boat," Odin snarled. "I should have had a better team." He kicked the boat in frustration, frightening Rosa and Lily once again. The timid way in which the girls hugged each other only made him madder. "You're the dumb one," Ponzi yelled back. "You keep wrecking everything we make." Uncle Louis had spent most of his time helping this group. Returning to their side, he asked, "What's going on?" Red with anger, his pale blue eyes glaring, Odin complained, "It still doesn't float." "Odin put holes in the bottom," Ponzi stated matter-of-factly with his hands on his hips, "and now the water seeps in." "It was to attach the corks," Odin yelled. "How else could we have attached them?" "I would have figured something out," Ponzi argued. "It's okay," Uncle Louis told them both. "The whole purpose of this project was to learn about building boats. You've now learned that water quickly finds its way into any tiny crack or hole, so you've learned a valuable lesson. You're welcome to make a new group and build another boat anytime you want." "I'll never build another boat," Odin hollered. Uncle Louis breathed deeply. "Go sit down, Odin," he ordered sharply, "and no more outbursts or you'll miss lunch." The no lunch threat was about the only warning that had an impact on Odin. He plopped down on the sand and mumbled grumpily to himself. Charlie, Vahid, and Kenzie, the farmer boys, had only used corks and building boards. They had worked for a long time to make an angular front on their boat so it could cut through the water, but it was very plain looking. There were no seats or sides to hold on to. Amy thought it looked more like a giant surfboard than a boat. Working next to that giant surfboard, Santa was trying her best to get her project stable, adding more corks to one side. She had partnered with Dia, Nancy, and Milan. While Dia had plenty of ideas about how she wanted the boat to look, she wasn't inclined to create the results, but only to give the orders. Nancy and Milan had worked hard, but had struggled to meld their ideas with Dia's orders or Santa's leadership. "I hope it won't flip over this time," Santa laughed merrily, climbing in. But within 2 seconds, Santa went headfirst into the water. Nancy and Milan looked at each other and shrugged. Sitting in the Red Bird on the shoreline, Amy watched the Beach Boys get ready. With only a few minutes left until launch time, they were carefully attaching a huge, round balloon to the pipe cleaners on the back of their boat. She was amazed to see that the stretchy balloon, like the one which had saved her from a bad fall, could become so big and round. "How did they do that?" she asked Zahir. "I don't know," he replied. "They've been experimenting at night, I guess. I don't even know what it's for. Does that balloon help the boat to float?" Everyone was waiting for Uncle Louis to begin the contest. Finally, he counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! Digging in with their paddles, Amy and Zahir were off to a furious start. Looking back, she saw that a few tinies were still trying to figure out how to paddle forward. Santa's boat looked like it was ready to capsize. Odin's team was sitting on the beach dejectedly with the leaky vessel pulled up next to them. A loud noise caught Amy's attention as suddenly the Beach Boys blew noisily past the Red Bird. She felt the air in her face as the large balloon at the back of the boys' boat quickly diminished in size. "That's what it's for," she exclaimed. "Who would have thought?" Zahir replied. The Beach Boys blasted into the lead and doubled the distance between themselves and the Red Bird until the balloon ran out of air. Then they pulled out their paddles and easily glided around the surfboard marker. Zahir and Amy pulled hard on their paddles, but they were only halfway to the turnaround point. The farmer boys were in last place, standing on their cork surface and paddling with all their might. By the time Zahir and Amy reached the surfboard and navigated a tight turn, the Beach Boys were breezing close to shore. Still paddling as fast as they could for second place, Amy and Zahir could now see all the others. Georgia, Vanitha, Yuyan, and Tina were laughing hard as they turned in hopeless circles, having hardly begun the race. Santa, Nancy, and Milan were completely drenched, dragging their overturned boat back to the beach, while Dia unhappily sloshed through the water behind them. Rosa and Lily stood up to cheer for the Beach Boys as they slid into the sand. There was no doubt about who had the fastest boat. Uncle Louis lavished praise on the Beach Boys' creative invention. Amy and Zahir won for strength and durability. Georgia, Vanitha, and Lily won for the most attractive. And then Uncle Louis gave out secondary prizes for persistence, team cooperation. Even Odin's team got a prize for enduring challenges. Without being asked, Damien and Lima began carrying all the projects to an area beside the school. They positioned the boats neatly under the trees close to shore. "Thank you," Uncle Louis said, astonished. Damien smiled. "The beach is the most important place." "We want to keep it clear," Lima agreed. "That was so fun watching you fly across the lake," Vanitha exclaimed shyly as Damien walked past. "You guys should put on another show sometime." It suddenly occurred to Amy that here was a unique way for the Beach Boys to trade, which was a very novel idea for Paradise. "We could all trade you for a show," she burst out. Damien looked up with interest. With a frown, Lima asked, "What do you mean?" "You can practice your cool tricks," she explained brightly, "and then put on a show for us to watch. Anyone who wants to watch has to bring something that you need." For a moment, everyone thought it over. "That's a great idea," Nancy praised. "I'd be willing to bring fresh bread for a good show." "I can help make some dinners," Amy put in. "I'll bring some fruit," Charlie added. "I'll use the shakers to let everyone know when things will start," Georgia offered. "Me too," said Kenzie. With a very thankful expression, Damien said, "That'd be amazing." He looked over at Amy. "Thanks." Amy smiled and nodded. "What do you think, guys?" Damien asked, looking at his friends. "Can we pull off a show in a week?" "Sure," they said, still confounded by the whole idea. "And maybe we can make a place to tie the boats up in the water," Damien offered. "Then everyone can come to the lake and go boating when they want." The other Beach Boys looked at him with astonishment. "That sounds like work," Lima frowned. Uncle Louis was quick to praise the idea. "Excellent suggestion," he said. "If you boys work on that, your time will count for trade in the store just like when you made the road." "Let's do it, guys," Damien encouraged. "It will clean up the beach and keep things organized." "And it'll be a great place to watch your shows," Georgia raved. Franz and Lima weren't as enthused by the idea, but with Damien's prodding, they finally agreed. Chapter 22. Go-karts and strange animals. In less than 2 weeks, the boat dock was completed. The Beach Boys directed the project, and many of the strong young teenagers had been eager to help. Uncle Louis had designed the long pier that extended into the water. Zahir, Vahid, Kenzie, and Milan had mined rocks every afternoon for an underwater foundation. The professor had sent in the needed elements for submerged cement, and with Uncle Louis's printed instructions, the Beach Boys had learned the right way to mix it. Rocks now formed a tall foundation that stuck out of the water and went far enough out to tie up the 5 boats that floated next to it. All along the flat wooden surface of the pier, they had nailed in brass pins to attach ropes to anchor the boats. The pier also gave everyone a great platform from which they could dive into the lake or catch fish. It would also be, as Georgia had suggested, the perfect place to watch the Beach Boys when the shows began. The new pier and the boats were a welcome addition for everyone except Odin and Ponzi, who had been spending a lot of time at the north end hidden in a forest. Apparently, they had built a new shack in the forest, as it was too hard climbing the cliff every night to sleep. Occasionally, they were seen racing to the lake when their chemical concoctions reacted unpredictably. If anyone ever needed a carry cart, there were always several stashed away on their side of Paradise. They were always first in line for lunch and dinner, but they refused to come to school in the mornings, choosing to sleep in instead. Generally, they were willing to trade rocks and cartloads of dirt for those who wanted to put in their own gardens, and the orchard girls were their best customers. From the orchard girls, they would get pottery or baskets of fruit to trade at the store with Nancy. At Louis's request, the professor continued sending in more reactive supplies, glad to see that Odin and Ponzi were occupied with some form of experimentation. Resigned to the fact that Odin and Ponzi weren't going to be studious individuals, the professor assured Louis they may not be going to school, but they are learning something. One morning, during the science lesson, Kenzie begged, "Can we please do another competition?" They had learned a lot about problem solving in math and had improved their writing skills, but after building boats, roads, and piers, many were eager for another hands-on project. "Who would enjoy another interactive activity?" Uncle Louis asked. Only 5 tinies didn't put up their hands. Lily, Dia, and Rosa preferred to just sit and listen. And since Odin and Ponzi weren't even there, they couldn't answer either. "All right, we will do another project," Uncle Louis agreed, "but this time I will choose the groups." There were sighs of relief and groans of disappointment. "What will we build this time?" Vahid asked curiously. Uncle Louis stroked his white beard. "I think it's time to experiment a little more with wheels and transportation," he considered. "We are done building houses and don't need so many carry carts." He clapped his hands together, remembering an idea he had seen online. "I think our one unnamed hill would be perfect for go-karts." Almost everyone was excited to know what a go-kart was. Uncle Louis walked over to the sand and drew a picture of the idea. "I'll get some instructions for you tomorrow," he said, "and we'll get to work." For the next week, the tinies kept busy with go-kart production. Ponzi heard about the project and began showing up to take part. Uncle Louis put him in a group with Damien and Franz. Uncle Louis's choice of groups worked well, and since they had instructions to guide them, the new project went much more smoothly than the boat competition had gone. Ponzi and Franz fooled around with the small saws for building boards and accidentally cut each other. Tina came to their rescue with the first aid kit, but Ponzi and Franz lost their saw privileges for the next 2 weeks. Amy, Rosa, and Georgia were in a group together, which they enjoyed, aside from Rosa's tendency to whine and give up whenever she didn't understand something. Since this wasn't a competition and they were all simply following instructions, Damien was quite willing to help the young ladies beside him, as well as his reckless partners. As they used the saws to cut the sticks to the right size, Damien did all the cutting for his group and often helped the girls. Sometimes all 3 boys helped the girls glue their pieces together, and the girls would help the boys. Of course, sometimes the boys also swiped the girls' pieces and a big chase ensued, and occasionally Georgia or Amy would hide the guys' wheels and watch with great amusement as they searched for them. One day, as they were trying to attach the wheels to long metal bars that the professor had sent in, Damien said, "Hey, Amy and Georgia, you should try surfing. I'll give you lessons." Amy stopped trying to force the wheel onto the bar. "Do you really think I could do it?" "With some lessons you could," he encouraged. The thought of swimming out to the big waves was intimidating to Amy. Uncle Louis had taught them enough to keep afloat for a few minutes, but she didn't feel confident to go in over her head. However, she was intrigued. "I'll try to get brave enough," she told him. Damien laughed, his brown eyes merry. "I'll be right beside you," he said. "You'll have the board to float on. It's fun." It did sound enticing, but Amy wasn't fully convinced, and Georgia was fearful. Franz looked up from under his stringy brown hair. "Girls are so scared of everything," he remarked with a disdainful laugh. "Not everything," Georgia and Amy answered defensively. Rosa spoke up timidly. "No, just scary black creatures and drowning." Ponzi confessed, "I'm not really a fan of drowning either." With a smile in his direction, Rosa giggled. "But you aren't afraid of spiders," she praised. Noticing that Amy was really struggling to get the wheel on her metal bar, Damien offered to help. She passed it to him gratefully. With his big hands, he clamped it on in 2 pushes. "Thanks," Amy and Georgia both said in unison, quite impressed. "Did you hear that strange animal last night?" Franz asked as he marked lines on a wooden board for Damien to cut. Damien and the young ladies looked over at Franz with surprise. "Strange animal?" Amy frowned, working on the frame of her cart. "How can there be a strange animal in paradise?" "Remember the spider?" Franz smiled, waggling his eyebrows mysteriously. "No one knows how that got in." Rosa's bottom lip started to tremble. I need to use the outhouse," she mumbled, rising to her feet. "I'll be back." And with that, she ran off. Georgia was looking carefully from one young man to the other. What did this animal sound like?" she asked with a nervous giggle. Franz made a screeching noise followed by a low growl in his throat. "I've never heard that," Amy stated confidently. "Down by the water we hear a lot more during the night than anyone else," Franz told her. "But then we're outside in the open, not shut up in a big, safe house." "I think I heard it the other night," Ponzi remarked thoughtfully, as he held the board for Damien to cut. It sounded huge, even bigger than Frodo. "I'm glad I'm not in a hammock. I wouldn't be able to sleep." Looking skeptically from Damien to Franz and then to Ponzi, Amy asked, "Are you just trying to scare us?" "Warn you is more like it," Damien put in, speaking seriously. There was not even a hint of a smile on his face. "You're pretty safe in that mansion on the hill, but if you ever hear that screech at night, just make sure it's not something trying to get in. And if it is, then yell for us," Damien told her earnestly. "We aren't far away. We'll come track it down." Georgie and Amy looked at each other uncertainly. When school was over that day, Amy went with Georgia to help Vinitha cut hair. Almost all the guys were in line for a cut. Kenzie, who didn't really care what his hair looked like, as long as it was out of his eyes, was quite happy to give his 2 bananas to Amy. Everyone else wanted Georgia or Vinitha. But even though Kenzie was Amy's only customer, she did feel that she was getting better. Most of her cuts were even. She just lacked artistic flair. Watching her friends, Amy took careful note of what all the guys liked. Damien wasn't so keen on close cuts. He liked his blonde curls. Franz kept his stringy brown hair on the longer side, just above his eyes. Charlie always wanted a clean, close trim. Zahir liked to keep a few dark curls on top with a close trim around the sides. Malayan liked his blonde hair to have a layered look, and Vahid kept his dark brown hair short and tidy. Odin had still not been convinced to cut his long blonde hair and preferred to keep his wild, disheveled appearance. Ponzi didn't really care what happened to his hair as long as it wasn't too short. After watching the others get a new look, Lima decided his afro needed a trim. Since Georgia and Vinitha were still working on Ponzi and Vahid, he walked over to Amy. "See what you can do," he said. "Just give me a trim, and I promise I'll dig up whatever you want from Mining Hill." "I would love a big flat stone for the patio we want to put in front of the mansion," she said, picking up the scissors. "Sure, I'll find you a good one," he promised. With all good intentions, Amy tried to give Lima a stylish haircut, but his hair was very matted from swimming. She struggled to make it all smooth. It became shorter and shorter until Lima begged, "Just cut it all off." "I'm so sorry," Amy apologized. Georgia was sweeping all the strands of cut hair into a pile. "You look good with a really close cut," she encouraged Lima. Lima shrugged. "My head looks so small," he moaned. "But that's okay. I won't need another cut for a long, long time." When they were done their work, the girls watched the surfers practice until it was time for dinner. It was fun sitting on the pier, dangling their legs in the warm water and chatting about stuff, even laughing about Fran's wild tale of the strange animal. "They are just teasing us," Georgia stated disdainfully. "I saw Franz wink at Ponzi." "Naughty boys," Amy smiled with a shake of her head. "Oh, look," Vinitha called out. "Damien is riding inside that wave." All the girls looked, and for a moment they couldn't see the tall, strong Tiny anywhere. Then all of a sudden he popped out from under the curling white water. Clapping and cheering, the girls caught Damien's attention, and he spun around on his board, which impressed them even more. As they watched him swim back out to catch the next wave, Vinitha asked the girls, "What color will you paint your go-kart?" The young ladies launched into a discussion on which colors went best with which and whether to decorate their go-kart with a swirl or stripes. Eventually, they heard the dinner bell ring. Twilight was falling as they raced to the store for the evening meal. Nancy and Milan had prepared a delicious fish chowder with lots of vegetables and bread. Since darkness was falling earlier and earlier after dinner, everyone headed to their homes as soon as they had finished eating. It was already getting quite dark. There were no moon or stars to be seen above. On the pathway up Rainbow Hill, Georgia and Amy found themselves glancing sideways nervously. Amy reminded her, "They were just teasing us." "I know," Georgia replied confidently. "The professor would never let a strange animal get in." "Well, aside from the spider," Amy qualified. "True, but that was an accident. I'm sure it won't happen again, ever." Even though the girls were talking bravely to each other in the darkness, the mere thought of a strange animal in the woods sent shivers up their spines. As they approached the top of the hill, they remembered the solar twinkle lights. The switch was close by. "Let's turn on the lights," Georgia said eagerly. "Then we can see better." "The Beach Boys hate them," Amy reminded her. "They can turn them off if they don't like them," Georgia stated, undeterred. "Okay, it would be nice to see." Carefully, they made their way along the well-worn path to the clearing. They were within 20 footsteps of the light switch when they heard rustling in the forest. Immediately stopping in their tracks, they looked around. It was dark. There wasn't any moonlight. "It's just a squirrel," Amy said dismissively. The rustling started again, and there was a loud thud. It was much louder than a squirrel would make. Georgia reached over and took Amy's hand. "Is it a deer?" she asked in a high, wavering voice. "Let's run home," Amy whispered. And then they heard it. It began with a screech and became a low growl. The noise was exactly like Franz had described. Hugging each other, the young ladies weren't sure which way to run. There was another loud thud, and then the screech was closer. The growl was louder. In fact, it sounded close enough to grab them. Both girls began screaming. They were too frightened to move. It was too dark to see anything clearly, and then the huge thing attacked. The girls tried to fight it off, punching and kicking and screaming as loudly as they could. A familiar laugh made Amy look up, and she realized they were punching and kicking Damien and Franz. Damien held Amy's arms against her sides. He was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Whew, you girls are tough," he howled. "What fighters!" Amy's heart was beating very fast and her mouth was dry, but she was relieved the strange animal was just two boys playing a prank. "Don't ever do that again," she scolded, breaking free. "We scared you, didn't we?" Damien teased, still laughing. "I'm sure everyone in paradise heard you scream." Suddenly, the lights turned on. Amy looked over at Georgia, who had broken free from Franz and was dusting off her pink sundress. "I was terrified," Amy admitted, "and I'm glad I got some good kicks in. You deserved it." At that moment, Zahir and Milan came running up the hill. "Is everything okay?" Zahir asked, looking at Amy in alarm. "We heard someone screaming. It sounded like they were hurt." "The guys just played a mean trick on us," Amy told him with a smile. "We thought we were being attacked by a strange animal that screeched and growled." "A strange animal?" Zahir questioned, unamused. Damien tried to explain the conversation that had taken place earlier that day, only he thought the whole thing was so funny that he could hardly tell the story without doubling over in laughter. Franz had to fill in the details. Zahir didn't seem to see the funny side. "Why are you looking so serious?" Damien retorted. "It was just a joke." Then Uncle Louis arrived, a little out of breath, and the story had to be explained once again. He was also upset. "I don't want you scaring the girls like this," he said. "It sounded like someone was really being hurt. Terrifying people is hurtful. We don't want this happening in paradise." Damien and Franz walked off muttering something about overreactions. And then everyone else parted ways for another quiet, peaceful night in paradise. Although it wasn't all that quiet or peaceful. Retaliatory, silly pranks were being discussed in the girls' mansion, and the occasional growl and peals of laughter were heard coming from the lake. Chapter 23. Probable or impossible? Evan made his way to the Arctic biome in twilight. He was meeting Seth and George in the research library located off the main entrance. It was a much quieter study area than the library in the rainforest biome, and therefore the one he preferred. Outside, just to the right of the glass structure which housed the winter-hardy animals, a large waterfall cascaded down a series of rocks, rushing away in a torrent that ran under a bridge. Canadian tundra gardens lined the winding pathway leading up to the main glass doors. In the spring and summer, the gardens were filled with small, unusual flowers, a few woody shrubs, and a variety of grasses. Now that it was fall, the flowers were gone, but the grasses had turned various colors of green, rust, and beige. Evan thought they were impressive to look at. Next to the gardens, in a fancy black iron and glass enclosure, a few little white foxes were finishing off their fish dinner, and a large caribou was quietly chewing his cud. Above the black iron enclosure was a giant banner that read, "The Arctic Biome. Come, explore the north. Marvel at your evolving world." Opening up the tall, blue-tinted doors, Evan breathed in the salty sea aroma. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows allowed him to see the polar bear and the seals swimming off on their well-separated sides of the large pool, which was surrounded by man-made snow and ice. The polar bear was the main attraction of the Arctic biome, especially at feeding time. She had perfected the art of catching fish in her mouth as they were tossed to her by her trainer, and she was very big. The seals on the other side of the tall glass enclosure could do the same trick, but they didn't have the same commanding presence. Seth was already sitting inside the library at the desk they always used. With a pile of heavy textbooks beside him, his red head was studiously bent over his notebook and calculator. He was punching in an equation. "Good evening, young man," Evan said to him in a friendly fashion. "Which exam do you have tomorrow?" "Biochemistry," Seth replied wearily. "It's going to be tough." "I agree," Evan said. "It will be tough. I remember that one." Sitting down across from Seth, Evan quizzed him for a couple of hours on various formulas, the components of a cell, methods of communication between the cells, and the steps to ward off disease and mutations. He showed Seth the diagrams in the textbooks which he needed to memorize and had him draw a few from memory. "So, any more questions?" Evan asked, noticing that it was now past 8 o'clock. "I do have one," Seth admitted, "but it won't be on the exam tomorrow." "That's okay," Evan assured him. "What is it?" Seth hesitated. "You've studied science for many years," he began. Pointing to the starry sky, which could be clearly seen through the glass greenhouse structure, Seth asked, "Have you ever looked up into the sky at night and wondered where it all began?" "You mean like the universe?" Evan frowned. Seth nodded. "Well, I guess the simplest answer is that it all began at the Big Bang." With a shrug, Seth replied, "That's perhaps the most accepted answer at the moment, but how can you be sure it's true?" "Physics and cosmology aren't my areas of specialty," Evan admitted, "but most scientists would affirm this theory correlates with the evidence we have available. I trust the scientific community. There are a lot of brilliant minds at work." Seth prodded a little more. "But the way knowledge and understanding develop," he said, "theories change based on new discoveries." He pointed to his textbooks, adding, "What I'm studying right now wasn't known 100 years ago, and some of it would have been considered preposterous." "Fair enough," Evan conceded. "But what does that have to do with the Big Bang?" "Well, take Einstein, for example," Seth elaborated. "He had a brilliant mind, yet he struggled to remain unbiased by accepted scientific understanding even when the evidence challenged it. His own cosmological model in 1917 showed the universe was expanding, not static. But because he accepted scientific belief at the time, which stated that the universe was static, he altered his own model to fit the scientific beliefs of the day." "True, I had heard that," Evan considered. "And I believe that only 15 years later, when the discoveries by Hubble and his colleagues showed the universe was expanding, Einstein had to admit he'd been wrong to doubt his original cosmological model, adding that his cosmological constant had obscured the truth. He'd made a major breakthrough, Evan reflected, but he doubted it." With a nod, Seth agreed. "So if a brilliant mind like Einstein could be biased by the prevailing mode of scientific thought," he reasoned, "who's to say the scientists of today aren't biased in their interpretation of the Big Bang?" Shaking his head, Evan smiled. "The theory will likely be fine-tuned as new information becomes available," he admitted. "But that's what we scientists do. Science is all about asking hard questions and searching for answers. It's through the process of experimentation, calculations, and trial and error that we discover and map out better theories. I find it exhilarating. We're like explorers discovering new lands." "I love it too," Seth agreed with a chuckle. "And I do believe that following the true scientific method can lead to the discovery of truth. But if we are explorers, the maps we inherit from earlier generations may sometimes turn out to be off track, leading everyone in the wrong direction. That's a bleak outlook, Seth, Evan frowned. Seth paused before responding. Solomon, the wisest man in the Old Testament, said in Ecclesiastes 3 that God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Seth, Evan rebuffed with a laugh, you're at university now. You're on high-level lectures, reading from the best textbooks, learning from some of the most intelligent humans that have ever lived. Most readily dismissed any notion of a God. Many scientists dismiss God, but not all, Seth reminded him. But it's so unlikely, Evan argued earnestly, even though he hadn't dismissed the concept completely himself. There's just no proof or evidence of a God, he stated harshly. The universe began with the Big Bang, and physics shows the theory is the most plausible explanation. My best advice for you, is one budding scientist to another, is to go where the evidence leads. But what if the evidence we think demonstrates a Big Bang is actually pointing to the beginning of God's creative act? Seth reasoned. No way, Evan retorted with a laugh, having never considered this possibility. That's just trying to force God into modern scientific discoveries. You won't make accurate discoveries if you are biased like that. You need to open your mind and read what other intelligent scientists have written. Have you read Professor Lemans' book, Faith or Fact, An End to Delusion? Yes, Seth nodded. It's pretty hard-hitting. Threw me for a loop initially. I had to take a few days off school to recover. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Evan commiserated. But it's better to know the truth, right? Then he frowned. And you're still arguing for a God? It wasn't the only book I read, Seth assured him. Scientists always gather sufficient data before making final conclusions, right? Okay, Evan shrugged. So then what? I searched everything that had been written in response to his book. There are numerous articles both for and against his book, and even some online debates and public lectures that critique and challenge his claims. But how convincing were any of those challenges? Evan prodded. Who was giving them? You've got to be unbiased, Seth, if you really want honest answers. Of course, faith-based communities aren't going to agree with Professor Lemans. There are excellent critiques from scientific researchers, physicists, mathematicians, and scientific philosophers. The best debate was between a physicist and Professor Lemans. I'll send you the link, he said, picking up his phone and Googling the debate online. It took place 10 years ago, shortly after his book was released. The physicist, Dr. Mason, clearly shows that faith or fact has a lot of slickly worded arguments and suppositions, but not much in the way of hard evidence or data. No way, Evan argued. There have been rave reviews in the scientific community for his book. Professor Lemans must have based his book on hard evidence, or he would never have gained such tremendous support. Have you looked at anything that critiques his work? Well, no, Evan admitted hesitantly, taken off guard. Have you considered any arguments from those who were once atheists and now follow the evidence that leads them to admit that a highly intelligent creator, like the God that many believe in, is the more probable explanation for the existence of such a perfectly well-tuned universe? With surprise, Evan clarified. You're telling me that there are respected scientists who believe in the possibility of a God based on actual evidence? No one I know has ever mentioned this. Really? Many, Seth assured him, and their writings, debates, and lectures are all available online. He sent the debate link to Evan's phone, and there was a beep in response. If you recognize the way in which bias can skew an investigation, then you should also consider the arguments on both sides, and then decide where the weight of evidence lies. With a shrug, Evan replied, I'm sure the Big Bang explains everything better than a creator God. The redhead disagreed. Even the best theories attempting to explain how the Big Bang could have worked still require pre-existing matter and a specific, purposeful cause for the universe to begin at that moment, Seth argued. Up until the 1930s, scientists, including Einstein, did not believe or accept that the universe had a starting point like they do today. But the Bible has always stated that there was a specific moment in time when it all began. The very first verse in the Bible states, In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. God prepared the matter. He was the cause. He spoke a word and it happened. Given enough time and opportunity, anything could happen without him, Evan reiterated. With a thoughtful look on his face, Seth continued. Okay, if you were to go out one wintry morning and see a well-sculpted snowdrift, would you assume your neighbor had spent weeks planning its design and a whole day carving the shape? No, Evan frowned, wondering what Seth was setting him up for. Any Canadian knows what wind does to snow. Right, Seth nodded. And when you examined the snowdrift carefully, you would find that it was a pile of intricate snowflakes, but nothing more than that. Of course, Evan agreed. Seth smiled. But let's say the next morning you went out and discovered an elaborate ice image, a totally perfect representation of Professor Lemans. It was sculpted with all the white hairs of his goatee defined, the wrinkles in just the right places, even a cell phone sticking out of his right lab coat pocket. Evan had to laugh as he imagined the scenario. And not only that, Seth continued dramatically, inside the ice sculpture, there was a system of lights that perfectly illuminated the professor's image at night, and a tiny electronic speaker that played a recording of his last lesson on biochemistry, ending with, "This is your world. Get out and solve the problems." Would you assume the wind had been at work again? Evan chuckled and rolled his eyes. Okay, I see where you're going with this, Seth, he told him unappreciatively. Of course I wouldn't. The wind doesn't do exact images and insert lights and recordings. Where would it even get them from? Exactly, Seth agreed. But neither can blind chance. If you look carefully at any living creature, you don't discover a well-sculptured pile of snowflakes, or dirt in our case. Instead, you find something that is increasingly complex the more carefully you investigate. It's not a matter of one helpful mutation at a time. There are millions of intricate, perfectly functioning parts, all fully connected and completely necessary for life to be possible. Even if we gave it millions or trillions of years, the wind could not make a perfect replica of Professor Lemans. Ever. Evan sighed deeply. Consider just the complexity of a simple cell, Seth prodded further. There are two basic molecules required for the cell to function, the amino acids that combine to form proteins, and the nucleotides that combine to hold the information of our genes, instructions to create proteins. As you know, these molecules are composed of base elements, which, when combined together, make more complex structures. The DNA, or genes, provide instruction on how the amino acids must be assembled into a protein structure. Evan frowned. Given enough time, anything is possible. Seth shook his head and pressed his point further. But the beauty of the complexity increases when you see that the proteins are necessary to replicate and assemble the DNA. You see, both the amino acids and the DNA are necessary together. This shows the impossibility of life springing into existence through mere chance, because neither amino acids nor DNA can exist without the other. Both must have come into existence together, which could only have happened if a designer was creating life intentionally. Seeing that his friend still looked doubtful, Seth added, taking this one step further, protein structures, amino acids, are also necessary to read the DNA instructions, which then are needed to assemble proteins from these instructions. It's not just a matter of time, opportunity, or probability. Macroevolution is actually impossible. And as human beings, we can't even create one simple, fully functioning living cell. Oh, yes, we can, Evan interjected, a little overwhelmed by his friend's lengthy outburst. You may not be aware of it, but cell therapies are being created for cancer treatments. In an IVF research, scientists design genetically healthy embryos. Can anyone create a cell from scratch, using only the base elements? Well, no, Evan admitted, rather deflated. This fact had already caused him much anguish when the professor spoke of creating paradise. We still require existing functional cells with the genetics already available. He sighed. I guess only life can produce life. Closing up the textbooks on the table, Evan got ready to leave. However, Seth was tightly wound up and he wasn't quite finished. Laying his hand on Evan's arm, he asked gently, Evan, how do you think a great designer would feel if someone closely examined his ingenious craftsmanship and then told everyone that it all just happened by chance. Evan rose from his chair. His face was flushed. All the best on your exam tomorrow, Seth, he said firmly. Get those diagrams memorized tonight. I will, Seth promised, sighing heavily. Without another word, Evan headed home to his small basement apartment, a dinner of ham and eggs, and his own niggling thoughts. Chapter 24. The Bump on the Hill. Once the go-karts had been fully assembled and painted, they were finally ready for use. For the first hour that morning, Uncle Louis allowed the teenagers to push each other around on level ground. Then they advanced to rolling down the slope from the store. They could get all the way to the dry, rainy riverbed. With some fine-tuning, everyone's go-karts worked well, even Ponce's and Lima's. The two dogs loved chasing the new inventions. After lunch, Uncle Louis said, "Does everyone feel ready for the big hill?" There were loud cheers. "All right, then," he said. "Let's head out." Just to be sure they were all ready for the challenge, Uncle Louis started them out only halfway up the hill. "Stay away from that bump," he said. "When you get really good at handling your go-kart, the bump will be a lot of fun. But for now, I just want you to get used to steering and managing your speed." We can handle the whole hill," Lima complained. "I want everyone to wait a little longer before you try from the top," Uncle Louis cautioned. "What's he so worried about?" Odin grumbled to no one in particular. Ponce, Damien, and Franz complained loudly about avoiding the bump, but Uncle Louis wasn't backing down. However, even with the restrictions, the ride was so fast and fun that the grumbling gave way to lots of laughter, happy shouts, and delighted screams. Two tinies fit comfortably in one go-kart, but it was possible for three to ride together if they hung on tightly. Odin hadn't made a go-kart, but he joined Ponce for several rides. Amy overheard him admit that he wished he'd made one too. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, Uncle Louis called out, "I think it's time to take a break for dinner." Several tinies were already halfway up the hill. "Just one last ride all the way from the top," Kenzie begged. "This is so fun." The tinies had learned well and were demonstrating good control of their carts. "All right, then. One last ride all the way from the top," Uncle Louis agreed. Everyone below eagerly grabbed their carts and began pulling them up the hill. Fredo and Maxie bounded after them. "Can I ride in the cart on the way up?" Rosa begged Amy as they began to trudge upwards. "My legs are so tired of climbing." Amy stopped and considered her request. Rosa wasn't tall, but she was quite round and heavy. "Can we push her up, girls?" "We can try," Georgia said unenthusiastically. She turned to Rosa. "If you're so tired, why don't you just stay back this time?" "But I love the ride down," Rosa moaned. "I just don't like walking up." Damien was already halfway up the hill with Ponce and Franz, but he overheard the girls' conversation. "I'll help," he offered, running back to give his assistance. "Oh, good," Rosa said with relief, climbing into the cart. Amy smiled gratefully. "Thank you," she said to Damien. She grabbed the rope tighter and began pulling hard. Georgie and Damien pushed from behind, and the cart went up the hill at a good speed. By the time they reached the top, they were last in line to go down. Charlie, Santa, and Milan had a big, clunky go-kart, but once it picked up speed, it went quite fast. Maxie chased it all the way down, barking as she ran, and Santa hooped and hollered. Zahir, Vanitha, and Lily had the most attractive go-kart. Vanitha had painted flashy blue swirls all over it. Zahir steered well, even though he had coerced Fredo to sit on his lap. Crowded into the back, the two girls screamed with delight as they zipped along. Next, the girls watched Damien, Ponce, and Franz fly down the hill, reluctantly avoiding the bump in the middle, and swerving skillfully past the trees on the edge of the forest. Everyone cheered when they made it all the way to the train tracks. They had gone further than anyone else. "Let's beat them," Amy said impishly, her blue eyes sparkling. "I'll steer." She took the front seat while Rosa climbed in behind her. "Oh, don't go too fast," Rosa wailed, "and please tuck your hair and ribbons in so they don't hit me in the face." Amy didn't respond with words, but she frowned. A little irked, she tucked her ribbons inside her dress and tied her long wavy hair into a bun. "See if you can get over the train tracks," Georgia encouraged. I'm scared, Rosa pleaded. Let's just enjoy a nice ride down the hill. Push us off, Amy said to Georgia. Georgia put her hands on the cart and ran, pushing the cart as fast as she could to the edge of the hill. Then she jumped in behind Rosa. They were off, faster than Amy had ever gone before. Yes, we're going to beat them, she yelled. Amy knew she needed to avoid the bump, but it came too quickly. For one glorious moment, they were flying through the air, laughing and squealing. Then the cart landed hard, nose first. With the impact at the front, the force pushed up the back end of the go-kart and it flipped completely over. As their vehicle continued to roll down the hill, the passengers rolled with it, colliding repeatedly with the hard ground, the wooden go-kart, and each other. Finally, after what seemed like ages, the cart came to rest on top of its unmoving passengers at the bottom of a hill. Everyone came running. Did you see that? Odin laughed loudly. Ponzi was laughing too. The go-kart landed right on top of them. But they were the only ones laughing. Uncle Louis knew the accident was serious. Chapter 25. Tragedy and Challenges. Kneeling down beside them, Uncle Louis called out fearfully, "Girls, are you all right?" Amy opened her eyes. "Yes," she groaned, "but I hurt everywhere." Georgia rolled off Rosa. "I'm okay, but I don't want to do that again." As she tried to push herself up, she grimaced and said, "My wrist hurts." Rosa still hadn't moved. Her eyes were open with a strange, glassy stare. "Rosa," Uncle Louis called out sharply. "Rosa, are you okay?" There was no response. He reached out and touched the top of Rosa's head, and then drew back his blood-covered fingers in distress. She's bleeding badly," he called out with great concern. "Someone run for the first aid kit." Kenzie and Zahir took off toward the store. Uncle Louis felt Rosa's neck for a pulse. Then he tried her wrist. He could tell she wasn't breathing. By this time, Georgia and Amy were sitting upright, feeling his sense of panic. All the others crowded around to see what was going to happen. Blood was pooling around Rosa's head. Her eyes stared blankly without seeing. "This can't be," Uncle Louis kept saying anxiously. "This can't be." Uncle Louis felt terribly alone and unprepared for such a horrendous accident, even though he had done so well on the first aid exam. He knew the theory. He had seen it performed in YouTube videos, but he had never practiced the techniques. He also had a strong feeling that Rosa's injuries required more medical intervention than he could provide. He was almost certain that she must have fractured her skull. Frantically, he initiated CPR, much to the disgust of his teenaged onlookers, who were still waiting for Rosa to wake up. He could see her chest rise and fall, just as it should. That was good. But as he alternated between chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, he was very concerned over the amount of blood she was losing. He anxiously debated in his mind whether he should run to the cave and call the professor or keep up the CPR and hope that Rosa would start breathing again. The young lads returned with the first aid kit rather quickly, but in Louis's mind it had seemed to take forever. In a panic, he didn't explain anything to anyone, just hastily bound Rosa's head with one long piece of cloth and returned to his task, trying to bring her back to life. Without a watch or a clock, he had no way of gauging how many minutes were passing by. Gradually, he began to wear out, and nothing had changed. Desperately weary, Uncle Louis knew he had to call the professor, whatever risk there may be to disclose the secret cave. Staggering to his feet, he panted, I just need to run and get help for Rosa. Stay, don't move her. I'll be right back." Pushing himself as fast as he could, Uncle Louis ran to the cave. He fumbled frantically to open the lock on the door. Dashing in, he pressed the professor's contact number. The phone rang over and over. Since the professor was teaching a class, it took a few tries before he answered. "What is it, Louis?" he asked, standing outside the door of his lab. "We've had a terrible accident on the go-kart hill," he blurted out. "I think Rosa may be dead." His words tumbled out as he struggled to catch his breath. "She has no pulse. None. There is blood coming out of her head. She's not conscious, and her eyes are glazed over. I've done CPR. Jacques Lemans was horrified. Poking his head back into his room, he called out loudly, "Class is dismissed." Then he began running down the halls of the university, heading straight for the rainforest biome. What happened, Louis? He begged. The girls were coming down the hill far too fast, Louis tried to explain, his hand beginning to tremble. And they hit the bump. They were flung out of the cart, and then it landed on them while they all rolled down the hill. Ça allures, the bump, Jax cried out, bursting through the university doors and out into the cold. Who was driving? He queried, running and slipping along the snowy sidewalk in his dress shoes. Amy, Uncle Louis relayed, and Georgia was the other passenger. The professor was seeing it all in his mind, the go-kart rolling down the hill, colliding with the girls over and over. How he regretted making the bump. Is Amy okay? How's Georgia? He fretted anxiously. Louis suddenly realized he hadn't thoroughly examined the others. He had been completely focused on Rosa. I think they're all right, he cried, as tears welled up in his eyes, but definitely bruised and shaken. I'm going to send in the train and take Rosa out, the professor said quickly, and then he fell hard as his shoes slipped on the icy snow at the front doors of the biome. Covered in wet slush, the professor picked himself back up and pulled open the door. Having seen him slip, Rachel was running to help him. I'm okay, he assured her quickly. Dashing past, he headed toward the mirrored hallway. Still holding the phone to his ear, he called out to Louis, I need you to get Rosa to me as quickly as possible. If you think any of the others may be seriously injured, I'll send the train back in for them. But then I'll know about your side, Louis began to sob. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. I don't want to ruin your plan or lose a life. This is almost beyond me. Quickly looking around, the professor saw that Rachel was watching him with bewilderment. He didn't have time to explain the crises, and he certainly couldn't use the drop floor route. Racing around to his office door, he tried to give calm support and encouragement, appreciating that Louis was overwhelmed. The train will be heading in shortly, he assured him, breathing heavily, as he unlocked his door and ensured it relocked behind him. You did well to perform CPR, he praised. That was very important, Louis. Do you remember how to recognize a medical emergency? Yes, Louis sobbed. Running through the viewing hall, Jax relayed the warning signs to Louis once more, just to refresh his memory. Reaching the supply room, he grabbed a small stretcher from the first aid shelf and put it on the train. From the ice machine, he grabbed some tiny cubes for the girls and placed them in a small pail. I'm sending in a stretcher, he told them, somewhat out of breath. Get the young guys to help, immediately, and put Rosa on the train. Then check Amy and Georgia thoroughly. If anything seems questionable, contact me and I'll send the train back in. Thank you, Louis replied with relief, wiping the tears from his eyes and face. I will. I hope you can do something for Rosa. I'll do my best, the professor promised, reaching toward the train button on the wall. I'm sending the train in now, he relayed urgently. There's ice for the girls. Get back to them as quickly as you can. Goodbye, Louis. I love you, and thanks for trying your very best. By the time Louis raced back to the site of the accident, the train was pulling up to the store with its whistle blowing. Zahir, Charlie, and Vahid stood up uncertainly, looking in its direction. Run! Louis called out to them. Unload the train and bring all the supplies. Reaching the sad little group gathered around Rosa, he saw they were trying to engage her in conversation. Amy was waving her hand frantically in front of Rosa's eyes, saying, Look at me, Rosa. I'm right here. Can you see me? Tears welled up in Louis's eyes. He hoped that his diagnosis was wrong and that the professor could make Rosa better. He hated to think that such a fun experience could have gone so wrong, ending a precious life. Well, a few of the young teens had seen the dead spider, Zahir's fish, and the occasional dead insect. Nothing of such importance had ever died in paradise. I really haven't explained death to them, he thought anxiously, as the boys raced toward him with the supplies. And while I've heard about it, I don't really fully understand it either. What will I say if Rosa is actually dead? Ponzi's bronze face was turned in his direction. His dark eyes were troubled. You said you were going to get something to help Rosa, he challenged. Why don't you have anything with you? For a moment there was a fearful look on Uncle Louis's face. I couldn't find it, he lied. He felt even worse. He glanced quickly at Odin and saw the suspicious gleam in his pale blue eyes. But there was no time to discuss the matter. Charlie and Vahid had brought the stretcher, and Zahir had the pail of ice. Looking at the long apparatus he was carrying, Charlie inquired, What is this thing? It's a stretcher, Uncle Louis mumbled. This is how we're going to carefully pick up Rosa so that we don't hurt her. Tears began running down his cheeks again. None of the tinies had ever seen Uncle Louis cry. Odin ran over to help lift Rosa onto the stretcher. "I'll take it," he said brusquely to Charlie, picking up the handles with Fahid. "Let's get Rosa on the train," Uncle Louis said gently to everyone. Quietly, everyone followed Odin and Fahid as they carried Rosa on the stretcher. Georgia and Amy were limping a little, and Georgia was holding her arm gingerly, but Louis observed they were both alert, interacting normally with the others, and moving well without any serious grimaces of pain. Now that the professor was nearby and aware of all that was going on, Louis didn't feel quite so overwhelmed. It wasn't all on him. After Rosa had been put on the train and the train began backing out, Uncle Louis called Amy and Georgia over to the store deck. Everyone else followed quietly, unsure of what to do. Uncle Louis made sure the two girls didn't have any broken limbs or double vision or severe pain in any places. Georgia had sprained her wrist, but could still move her fingers freely, so he wrapped ice in a cloth and placed it on the swelling. He attended to the scratches and sores with antibiotic ointment, and Tina helped him to put on the bandages. When he was done, he sat down with relief and weariness. All the anxious faces were looking at him for answers, but he didn't feel he had the mental presence of mind to talk about what had just happened. "I'm going to read everyone a story," he said. "We all need to just stay calm and see what will happen with Rosa." "I'll get some books," Kenzie offered. Uncle Louis nodded gratefully. Kenzie, Zahir, and Fahid ran to the school to grab some stories off the deck. With his head in his hands, Uncle Louis desperately hoped, "Maybe the train will come back soon and Rosa will be all right." Disconcerted and traumatized, the Tiny sat on the store deck waiting for the books. Odin suddenly challenged him. "Something's going on," he said with a tremor in his voice. "You're always running to the outhouse for help. I've been there. You're not going to find any help in there. And how does this train know when to come and go and what to bring? Something's up." Exhausted, Uncle Louis sighed heavily. He had expected that his sudden dash to the cave would ignite curiosity. Weary, very emotional, and disappointed that he had lied to the Tinies, he resolved to tell the truth. The Tinies were getting older and wiser, and there was no way the cave could stay a secret forever. Thankfully, there was only one key. "I guess it's about time I let you all in on a secret," Uncle Louis relayed in a serious manner, just as the boys came back with the books. Thanking them, Uncle Louis suggested they sit down for a moment as he had something important to say. When everyone was seated and looking up at him, Uncle Louis began. In Rainbow Hill, there is a cave with a locked door. Some of the boys leaned forward to listen better. "This is a private place that none of you are allowed to enter," he warned wearily. "In this cave, I can talk to the professor. Just like you had a window in the nursery and could see Evan, I have a window to the professor. He can hear me, and I can hear him." The Tinies were wide-eyed with wonder. Even Odin was impressed. "So there really is a professor," Lema remarked. Franz rolled his eyes dubiously. "Does he live in the cave?" Santa asked. "Yes, he is real," Uncle Louis frowned. "He doesn't live in the cave. He comes and goes just like Evan did in the nursery." Santa nodded slowly. Several Tinies looked at the cave as though they were wondering whether the professor would fit. "How does he get in?" Franz asked. "There is a way," Uncle Louis told him. "Communication between myself and the professor is vital here in Paradise," he explained, "especially in emergencies. I tell him what we need, and the professor or Evan will send it in on the train. But I'm the only one who is allowed in the cave for now. Does everyone understand?" All heads nodded. There was a mischievous smile on Odin's face that Uncle Louis didn't trust. "If anyone ever goes inside that cave without my permission," Uncle Louis warned sternly, "there will be serious consequences. They will completely lose their freedom in Paradise." He paused, trying to think how best to explain loss of freedom. "They will have to stay beside me all day and sleep on my couch at night," he said threateningly. "Don't try it." For a few minutes, everyone sat in silence, absorbing the new information and thinking through the instances when the train had come in at odd times. Uncle Louis stood up to read a story. Amy had been twisting her hands nervously the whole time. Before he could even walk one step forward, she asked, "Uncle Louis, what does it mean to be dead?" At the start, his face fell. 19 curious pairs of eyes were looking in his direction. He thought of telling Amy that they didn't need to discuss this just yet, that hopefully Rosa would be fine and that it would be better to read a story and calm down. But he could see they all desperately needed to talk. "Come down to the beach with me," he encouraged everyone. All the tinies gathered around Uncle Louis on the beach, sitting in the warm white sand. Above, the sky was overcast and darkening, but the surfing waves had ceased and were now gently lapping against the shore. "This is a really hard thing to talk about," Uncle Louis began, looking up at all the bewildered faces and feeling tears well up in his own eyes. "Up until today, you've only known a fairly trouble-free existence. Yes, we've had one broken bone, some fights, scrapes, and burns, a day of heat, and even a scary incident with the spider, but for the most part, life has been pretty good. Would you agree?" Everyone nodded aside from Odin and Franz. Dia and Ponzi didn't seem completely sure and shrugged their shoulders. Uncle Louis sighed. "But we won't live like this forever. None of us will." "We won't?" Amy questioned anxiously. "What do you mean?" "Well, the professor can help us with a lot of hurts and damage, like when Charlie broke his arm. It's all better now, right, Charlie?" Charlie nodded and waved his arm around. "Sure is," he said. With a sad smile, Uncle Louis continued. "There are some things that cause damage which can't always be repaired. We are alive right now, but if we stop breathing or our hearts stop beating," he paused and swallowed hard, "sometimes they can be restarted, but sometimes they can't. If we are dead, that means we can't start breathing again unless the professor finds a way, but it seems he hasn't found one just yet." "He hasn't?" Amy asked in a panic, turning very white. "But the professor is the mastermind of paradise," Zahir reasoned. "If he made us once, then why can't he just make us again?" Uncle Louis took a deep breath, and then another, as he pondered the question. "I'm going to have to ask him about that, Zahir," he said at last. I don't know that I have all the answers on this. I do hope that maybe there is some way." "There's got to be a way," Kenzie piped up. "Maybe he can do some experiments on Rosa and discover how to do it." "True," Uncle Louis nodded. "I hope you're right, Kenzie. But in the meantime," he said, looking around at everyone, "be careful what you do. Your life is very precious." "We will fix that bump on the hill before anyone else goes on it," Kenzie exclaimed. He looked around at the group. "Who's willing to help me tomorrow morning?" Nearly everyone put up their hand. "Well, we only have 5 shovels," Kenzie considered appreciatively, "but we can all take turns." The tinies waited for the train that evening until the darkness had descended. Some of the young teens were falling asleep on the beach. Finally, Uncle Louis encouraged them all to go to bed. "Let's hope there is good news in the morning," he said, desperate to get to the cave and talk to the professor. "I'm sure the professor is doing all that he can to fix Rosa back up." With that hopeful thought in mind, the tinies straggled off to their homes, even though many would have a sleepless night.